We've already seen a great deal of commentary and talk and such about the U.S. Senate race in Missouri, and of course the presidential contest that's looming. But it occurred to us that it would be a good idea to finally come to grips with what happened in 2010 and why before we look ahead. And to help us with that today, we are honored to have with us very well-known columnist with the Columbia Tribune, Bob Roper. Bob is currently the chairman of the board of Central Trust and Investment Company, where he recently retired from his position as the president and CEO. But even more important from our point of view, at this point, he has been writing the column for the Tribune since 2007. He is a self-described cautious libertarian conservative, and he has written about things that we hold very near and dear at Show Me. Issues like doing away with the state income tax and the need for reform in our schools. But he also writes about politics, as you know. I'm sure you've all read his column, which is twice a month, I believe it is, Bob, right? Twice a month. So let's get his thoughts with no further ado on the 2010 midterm elections, what they mean, why they happened, and what it means going forward. Ladies and gentlemen, Bob Roper.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here. As a tall guy, I'm going to set this up as high as I can. Hopefully everyone can hear me. Am I coming through all right? I'm pleased that everyone is able to make it today as we endure yet another manifestation of global warming. Seriously, I want to talk today about the midterm elections. The quick part is the results. A little deeper are the causes of what happened, and particularly 2 or 3 points that I think are significant but not that much talked about or well understood. And then finally, what are they telling us about some long-term trends, particularly a couple of very important, what I call tipping points that I think our country is facing now and needs to face going forward. So with no further ado, I'll do that, and I'm going to try to go as fast as I can through a lot of it. I really want to talk particularly about the tipping points issue, because I see some extremely important issues that our country is facing, and I think they deserve a good quality of conversation throughout the land. Well, first of all, what happened? Well, the House of Representatives needed a change of 39 seats to flip to the Republicans. They in fact got 63. I think the president campaigned pretty well for his party, or it could have been actually worse, but it was still a major change. 7 Senate seats were picked up. They needed something like 9 or 10 or 11. So the Republicans now have 47 of those 100 seats. The Republicans, less well known, they picked up 6 governorships and now control 29. They have, going forward, full control, meaning the governorship, the House, and the Senate, of 20 seats, whereas Democratic control fell to 11 seats. Now, this is important. I'll talk about it in a little bit, and it gets down to the redistricting issues. The total number of pickups, this is hugely important. It's not very well known, but if you look across the land at House and Senate seats in the states, the total pickup was 675. That's a huge number. And actually, if you take a look at the pickups after 2008, it's well over 700 because of off-year elections in 2009. In our state, I think it can be said that for now at least, Missouri has flipped to a red state. 26 of 34 Senate seats are Republican. 106 of 163 seats are Republican in the House. So what really happened? I don't think it was actually a vote for the Republicans. I think it was rather the independents giving up on the Democrats, because they voted 55 to 40% for the Republicans. Rather, I think it was issues of the deficit and spending and health care and the national debt that really energized people as much as anything. And the election, therefore, became what's called nationalized. Normally, people run on local issues, congressmen and senators, but when you get it nationalized, it tends to be more national issues like the ones I just talked about. So what turned into a normal election became a wave election, or what I would actually call a tsunami. Part of the reason is, I think, over the last couple of years, the Democrats, with their huge majorities after 2008, either misread the mandate they got, or maybe they really didn't care, because the real mandate back then was disenchantment with the Republicans, and particularly George Bush, and a desire to fix the economy. Instead, the Democrats governed from the left, pushing a more European-style redistributionist welfare state, and they got the shellacking that the president talked about. Remember, we're really a center-right country. You don't always hear that very much in the media, but it's true. 42% of our population consistently says they're either conservative or very conservative. Only 20% say they're liberal. So when the Democrats and President Obama governed in a very liberal fashion, it didn't set real well. Okay, is it really as simple as I just talked about on those results? No, I don't think so. I want to talk about some of those ideas, particularly what I think are the new and more enduring forces that are at work. It's really, whenever you have a wave or tsunami election, it's a confluence of a lot of things. Number one, I've already talked about, and that's the spending. It isn't really well known, I guess, but President Obama has spent as much in 2 years as George Bush did in 8. So it's accelerated a bad trend. And by the way, I always like to let people know where I'm coming from. I forgot to do that early on. I was a reliable Republican for a long time, but considering what happened in the Bush years, the spending, the bad legislation, I guess I am just more of an independent now that is conservative, libertarian, business-oriented, etc. So you need to know that about me. I have a point of view, and I just told you what it is. Getting back to the spending, polls say, Rasmussen poll says that 68% of people voters want a smaller government, lower taxes, fewer services. Well, needless to say, that wasn't happening, and people were developing, in my opinion, an intuitive sense that something is badly wrong and it needs changing. Item 2, the second reason, also not too hard to fathom, it's the economy in general. We were technically out of this recession, I suppose, sometime in 2009, but it sure doesn't feel like it, particularly with unemployment around election time, around 9.6 to 9.8%. And so, of course, and by the way, that really doesn't tell the whole tale. The really key thing is to look at add in underemployment and people that have given up looking, and by the time you roll that all together, it's 17 or 18%. We have a terrible problem in this country in that regard, and that had an effect. Item 3, the Obama approval effect. It's not fair sometimes, but the president always gets his approval rate. And when good things happen, it goes up. When bad things happen, it goes down. He started his term up around 70%, but by election time it was around down to 40% or so. So of course people take it out on his party. I guess I can say a few reasons as to why. Obviously the spending, the government solutions in every case, GM and Chrysler, those bailouts, the mosque issue, the Arizona immigration law. Take your pick. There's a lot of reasons. The stimulus bill that didn't seem to stimulate, and on and on and on. And of course, Obamacare. And finally, to use George Will's famous phrase, an implacable hostility to the private sector. I think that's right. Item 4, the low regard of the Democratic House and Senate. Their approval rate by election time was 19%, 70% disapproved. So Harry Reid and Nancy Pelosi and their House and Senate really were a dead weight also. And it's not too hard to see why, because of what they were doing, and never passed a budget, corruption issues, To me, the coup de grace was when they brought in comedian Stephen Colbert to testify as a serious witness in a House subcommittee. Now, those are all very predictable. You've probably heard some or all of that before. Here's where the differences are. This is why I think this was a little more significant than a lot of people realize. First of all, and once again, it's that confluence issue. I think there's a large and growing sense in this country that Washington, the whole Washington culture, is fundamentally corrupt and out of control and out of touch. Think how often you hear now and have heard in recent years, they don't represent me. There's a feeling that it's an insider's game run by those who are somehow through money or lobbying or are on the inside, run by bureaucrats, sense of dependency, but most importantly, just a feeling that we don't really truly have a consent of the governed anymore in this country, and that something needs to be done about it. I've been detecting that feeling for a few years now, but I think it really started welling to the surface in the 2010 midterms. Pollster Scott Rasmussen has an interesting poll. He found out that the major division in this country is no longer between parties, but really between the political elites and the people. So he calls the two camps, one is the political class, and that's only about 10 or 15% of us, and the mainstream public. That's everybody else. That's about 60% to 70%. I guess the others that aren't included don't even know what's going on. The political class just is seen as running things by either being in office or wielding a lot of influence. And guess what? They trust how everything's going. They think it's going real well. But the mainstream public didn't feel that way and doesn't feel that way. They believe that about 67, let's put it this way, 67% of the political class thinks things are going well. 84% of the mainstream public disagreed. So whenever you have that kind of alienation, you're going to vote for change. And you don't hear that much talk about it, the difference, this growing feeling that things just are not working and that Washington no longer represents us. Another change that I picked up this year that has probably been quietly growing, but I think was significant, I think the voting public is different now. And what I mean there is, I read so often not many of our voters really knew much about what was going on there. There is a growing sense of alienation, but not necessarily knowing what's going on. I read an interesting article by a congresswoman from Tennessee, Marsha Blackburn, and she said that everywhere she went, she found a much more knowledgeable electorate. And the more they learned about Washington, the less they liked it, needless to say. And she also found more and more women getting active. And I'm not talking about Tea Party people. I'm just talking about folks in general. And she said that they're so worried about the future and how things are going, and it's because they're worried about their kids and their families, their grandkids, and on and on and on. And her take also was that the internet has become an extremely important tool in all that, and I guess you can add Twitter or Facebook and everything else in that era. And she said, because finally people were figuring out how congressmen and senators were voting rather than how they wanted you to think they were voting, and so people were so much more up to date. And by the way, I'm not so sure that the whole issue of internet-based knowledge improvement isn't going to go on, not just in the Middle East, but in a lot of other places as well, as people get more and more up to date on what's going on. So anyway, the electorate is changing, it's paying attention, and is very much engaged, more so than before. Finally, as far as game changers, as of course the Tea Party factor, I don't think we get that many what I'll call great awakenings in this country very often. You can think back through our history, there haven't been that many. But this may be. Remember, it was in reaction to the stimulus bill almost 2 years ago when that CNBC analyst, Rick Santelli, it's gone viral all over the place. People are still watching it, when he just absolutely did a rant on how crazy this was and et cetera, et cetera. And what's interesting is about the Tea Party folks is they have received probably the worst press I can imagine, just withering and malign and demeaning comments from the mainstream media and the Democrats. But you know, they're still pretty popular. About 50% of the population really seems to like them a lot. Anyway, they started out just in total disgust at the political class, but particularly the out of control spending. And another thing, and I'll talk about it a little bit when I get to the tipping points, they really mean it when they talk about wanting limited government and low taxes, less regulation, a high quotient of individual liberty, and a federalist system. They're not kidding. And I'll talk about the effect of all that. So anyway, they were a bit of a game changer too, in my opinion. As I said, over 50% of the people in this country like them, which is, by the way, quite a bit more than the political parties get. Social conservatives joined the GOP coalition in the 1970s, but this year the Tea Party folks decided to run as and be part of the Republican Party. I would think that suggest that they might want to try to find a few better candidates next time. They probably left 2 to 4 Senate seats on the table where some folks were successfully thought of or portrayed as either extreme or maybe just a little bit weird. But they joined the party, they came up with candidates, and they were active, etc. And in fact, I think you could say that they virtually rescued the George W. Bush got us out of those doldrums and rescued the Republican Party. I'll have something to say a little bit. Well, in fact, I'll go there right now. So I think there's about 3 new things that happened. What about questions going forward? Some of these are easy and are just standard issue political stuff. Some of them are a little bit more, not quite so apparent. First of all, will the what I call the uneasy marriage of the GOP and the Tea Party folks that we saw and I just talked about in 2010, will that endure? Well, as I said, I think they saved the Republican Party, the Tea Party folks did, in November of 2010. But it always comes with a catch, you know. There's a catch to that, and that catch is the GOP will now be held accountable by a libertarian-oriented and very engaged wing of the party. And if you don't think that's true, I would remind you that after the State of the Union address recently, there was the standard Republican response delivered quite well, by the way, by Paul Ryan, who talked about tipping points. But there was also another response, and that was by Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann, representing the Tea Party people. That would be unheard of previously, and that just shows you that this is a force that the Republicans have to reckon with, and they're not going away, and they mean business. So in other words, the Republicans, I think, are sort of on probation now, particularly with the Tea Party folks, but probably a whole lot of other people too that don't count themselves as that, but just want to see whether they're going to do what they said or just go back to business as usual. Because let's face it, for a number of years, the GOP was an accessory to a lot of bad or very bad stuff. Earmark abuses, huge spending, passing terrible legislation like McCain-Feingold, for example, which diminished our free speech rights, getting too close to big business and lobbyists. In other words, the old business as usual thing. So if the Republicans, that's issue number 1, if they go back to the old ways, I'm not sure the Tea Party folks won't bolt and form a third party, which might very well be the end of the Republican Party. Item 2, question 2, will President Obama triangulate? That's the famous word used about Bill Clinton back in the 90s, where suddenly he says the era of big government is over. He passes welfare reform and signs it, backs NAFTA for free trade, and gets reelected. With President Obama, I'm not sure he can or even wants to. My take on him, honestly, is that he is a true left-leaner. I don't know if I'll call him an ideologue, but he is a man of the left. And I don't know that he can do that. I think he'll try to pose as a moderate and try to get as much traction as he can, but you got even a little bit of a clue from his State of the Union address where he came across as sort of moderate, but did you notice that all of his solutions, as he talked about the Sputnik moment, or all government solutions, if you can believe it, high-speed rail and green jobs. I don't think a free marketer would have been talking that way. And he can always rely on his agencies to pass things like under the cloak of regulation, cap and trade, or perhaps card check, which is a long-sought union thing. Item 3, next question. Will the congressional Democrats moderate their views? Well, it was sort of an irony. Most of the moderates got beat that were Democratic, and so that means that with the more left-wing folks in charge, people like Ike Skelton was somewhat moderate, but he got beat, and a lot of others did too. So with the left wing and even firmer control, I don't see much movement there. And note that they did rehire Nancy Pelosi as minority leader, so she's still the leader. Item 4, another big effect, I touched on it earlier, the effect on redistricting. As you know, our federal constitution, well, and state also says that every 10 years, based on the census, we have reapportionment. It has 2 huge effects. One was how many House seats you're going to have. Unfortunately, Missouri loses one. We didn't grow as fast as other states did that either stayed the same or picked up. As an aside, in part in my view, because we have a state income tax. But right there, if you check the changes, it's probably right off the bat a pickup of 6 seats for the Republicans, simply because of states losing seats versus states gaining. It went from Democratic to Republican. Second, I already told you that 675 plus new people are in office. These, somebody has to draw those lines. Almost all states are done by the politicians. A few are done by commissions, but not that many. Probably not a bad idea to look at a commission, by the way, because it does tend to, the current system does tend to, those in charge put people in heavy districts that will tend toward more extreme views because you get where I'm going with that. So that probably isn't a bad idea. Anyway, throughout the states, these people that in our state, for example, the redistricting will be done by Republicans, and they have to draw the congressional lines, and they have to draw their own. I'm sure they have all kinds of gerrymandering pins in a special red color that are all ready to go from time immemorial since we've been around. That's the way things are done. The party in power gets to make things better for it and get their people retained in office. And it couldn't have come. These terrible results could not come at a worse time for the Democrats. Next question. Then I'm going to get to the tipping point questions. What will the Republicans do? I think they have a difficult job. They somehow need to please the Tea Partiers and the folks that really want some action done, particularly on this terrible spending and deficit problem. On the other hand, the liberal Democrats anyway, and the media are going to be gunning for them, saying you're going to kill off Granny with Social Security and everything else if you try to get this spending under control. So they have a tough job. I do think that they'll do certain things. They'll probably try to repeal, as you can see already, or at least defund wherever possible, Obamacare. I think they really will vote for some real spending cuts. The real size, I'll get to the real size of this problem later because it's so much worse than people think it is. I know there are items on the table right now to take it originating in the House Budget Committee, Paul Ryan's area, to try to get us back to 2008 levels. There will probably be an effort to privatize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, those two behemoths that were that were part of the heart and soul of our mess with the housing bubble and the financial crisis. But the big one is going to be, sooner or later, are they going to touch entitlements or not? You can't fix this problem unless you do something about Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, which are truly bankrupting this country and careening out of control. And that's where it gets a lot harder. So we'll see as we get going here how far they are willing to go between really fixing things and putting themselves at risk of saving their seat down the road. Now I want to get to the tipping point questions. All the previous stuff I talked about, interesting inside baseball stuff, we kind of want to know what happened and why. But it's a lot of it's about issues, tactics, strategies, etc. So and that's the kind of stuff you listen to and you see what I call Bigfoot correspondents out there talking about this or that race, or furrowed-browed analysts talking about all this stuff. They always do this as a horse race. That's fine. It is sort of interesting. It's competition. But those aren't the big questions of the day. This is who's up, who's down, what are they going to do, how are they going to stay there, and on and on. And that's what I want to That's what I want to talk now, and it's got two or three complexities to it. Here's the big question. And what I think has come to the fore in this election that not many people are talking about. Since the 1930s, the U.S. government has been growing in size and cost, control, reach without a whole lot of pushback. Some in the Reagan years, but not a whole lot. Will it seriously happen now? And ultimately, what kind of country, collectively, as a nation, do we want going forward? So those are the kind of things I want to talk about. Preliminarily, though, a quick observation. I've noticed that the Tea Party people and others who agreed with them, they started out totally concerned about spending, deficits, et cetera, as I talked about earlier. But I've also noticed that in this particular election, they've morphed into more than that. They actually have started reading the Constitution, the writings of the Founding Fathers, Federalist Papers, and now I think it's not just about spending and deficits. It's about what kind of country, what kind of government we want. And let me read you something here. I'll guarantee you a lot of them have read James Madison's Federalist Papers number 45. I think he was the most brilliant man and one of our key founding fathers that we owe so much to. He wrote, "The powers delegated by the proposed Constitution to the federal government are few and defined." To which I would say, really? Since the 1930s, I don't think so. So that's just sort of the issues that the more and more Tea Partiers are looking for. Ever since in the late 30s and 40s and since, the Supreme Court has largely shredded the Commerce Clause and expanded what the federal government can do. The point is, more and more people, not just Tea Partiers, but especially them, are more and more knowledgeable about this and very concerned, and they're not going to go away. They want what was intended by the founders and not what we are doing today. In effect, they've become passionate limited government advocates right now. Okay, two tipping point questions, both interrelated, both important. Number one, that's the looming financial catastrophe that I talked about, and I think it's worse than most people realize. There's a lot of economic work that's been done that shows that if your debt collectively it gets to the area of 90% of your GDP, you have a real problem as a country, because it takes so much money to service that debt that it really starts chipping numbers off of your growth rate, and you become just a sluggish also ran in the fight in the world economy in our competitive economy. Wasn't too long ago, it was 25% in this country. Then it jumped up to 45, and by most calculations, we're at about 65% right now. Obviously headed in the wrong direction. Take a look at Japan, for example. They had their mess, their everything cratered in the late 80s, early 90s, and they tried doing all this Keynesian stuff and just spent, borrowed, and the result is they are 200% of their GDP, and they just haven't amounted to a whole lot since. They're just lucky people have bought their bonds, but I've noticed that recently their bond ratings have started to decline. Likewise, the historic average since World War II for the amount the government spends of GDP, the amount that goes to government, has always been around 18, 19, 20%. We've now risen to 25%. And the problem there is that whether you have high taxes or low taxes, there's a little thing called Hauser's Law that says you're always going to bring in about 19 or 20%. So what that means is these huge deficits are with us forever unless we do something about the spending. And by the way, to get from 25% to 20, you don't have to be a math genius to know that's a 20% reduction in the spending. That's why it takes, you have to sooner or later look at entitlement spending or you will not get there. Deficit this year, by the way, is 9.5% to 10% of our budget. You can't keep doing stuff like that. So anyway, I touched on it earlier, but I just gave you some statistics that show how serious this problem is. Congressman Paul Ryan that I talked about earlier, he does have a plan. We'll see whether or not he gets any help on that or not. All right, tipping point question number 2. I already told you that since the 1930s, thanks to a compliant Supreme Court, we don't have much of a restraint on federal intrusion into where areas they hadn't been before and other areas. And of course, it's grown. So the question becomes, do we want to become a statist or collectivist country where government makes the decisions? Believe me, there are a lot of them around the world. Or do we want one with a free economy where individual liberty is not only protected but treasured? That's the big tipping point question that I think is coming to the fore, although we got to solve the financial, and they are interrelated. Let me read something here. Here is the Random House definition of socialism: a theory of or system of social organization that advocates the vesting of the ownership and control of the means of production and distribution of capital, land, etc., in the community as a whole, i.e. the state. Well, okay, that's a pretty big stretch. I would maintain that they said ownership and control. Change that to ownership or control. Think about that. If you own property or a business and you can't control it, but the state does, I'd say you have a significant problem on your hands. And that's what we're starting to see more and more of. We don't have to necessarily talk about socialism, but I do think that if you use the word control, where I did, it's a question. You could also call it economic central planning. You can call it state control through regulation. You can call it industrial policy. Or you can be a little more benign and just call it a big government welfare state. In an otherwise scathing editorial at the end of the year, the Wall Street Journal said this about the whole experience of the last couple of years. For today's left, the main goal of politics is not to respond to public opinion. The goal is to impose the dream of an egalitarian entitlement state, whether the public likes it or not. Sooner or later, they figure the anger will subside and Americans will come to like the cozy confines of the cradle-to-grave welfare state. Well, I don't know what we're going to call it. I've thrown out a couple of definitions there, a couple of possibilities, but I do know what the hallmark of this trend is, and that is not too hard to track. So here's what, regardless of what we call it, this whole trend and what we're heading to is, one, more regulation and control of private business and a larger and larger public sector. It's happened a lot. Number two, redistribution of wealth where the goal is equality of results and not of opportunity. Remember now that almost 50% of people do not pay income taxes now. Remember also that I think it's around 60% receive some sort of government benefit. So there's a lot of redistribution going on, but that's a hallmark of it. Another thing, item 3, misallocation of resources. I would maintain that our housing and financial crisis that has so deeply damaged our country was at least in part caused by the various government agencies like HUD and others that mandated banks and other institutions to make bad loans that they wouldn't have made otherwise if they'd been properly considered. So that misallocation occurs. Item 4 that you get out of this sort of a system that could be the end game. What I call, and others too, crony capitalism. And that's capitalism based on politics more than market and the free market and price signals. And so that's when you see what I call most favored companies running around because they're connected. For example, if you play ball with the government, you get competitive advantages. Not because you're better, not because you deliver a better quality good or services at a cheaper price, but because you're on the inside. So if you toe the government line, and you have to succeed in this kind of society, the government becomes your business partner or your helper. And you can see a lot of this. I'll give a few examples. Remember when the government took over GM and Chrysler? Remember what happened to the bondholders there for those companies? They basically got the shaft, and for some reason the courts didn't protect them. Meanwhile, the unions were taken care of just fine, thank you very much. Or GM is now rolling out the Chevy Volt, that new electric car. If there was ever a political car, that's it, because there's no market demand for that, but it's just one of those things that, in fact, the cost of it, if you took away the subsidies, you'd probably have to charge something like $80,000 a year for it. And we saw the bailouts to big banks, General Electric, et cetera. Another example, the ethanol boondoggle, and don't think for a second this doesn't touch both parties. One of my recent favorites is Obamacare, where the count now is above 770 waivers granted by the Health and Human Services folks, most and with an outsized number to their union friends. In other words, if my little company went and asked for a waiver, I don't know if I'd get anywhere, but 770 plus seem to be doing just fine. Another one would be in Massachusetts. There was a wind energy farm that finally closed down after $57 million of subsidies from the state of Massachusetts, so their taxpayers get to absorb all that. And this is just the kind of stuff that happens when you have crony capitalism everywhere. I think you get the picture. It just has a bit of a smell to it, and I have to love this little quote. Mickey Kaus is a liberal blogger, a liberal. And here's what he wrote recently about all this sort of stuff. Shouldn't Republicans hold hearings on the general threat of Putin-like corporatism, i.e., the insidious alliance between big government and favored corporate and union or labor interests? Pretty good quote. Putin-like. Another effect of this sort of thing is, and you see it everywhere, is the rise of the regulatory, what I call the regulatory state, where government gets that big and feels like they know better than you. And it's the rule by willful, unelected, unaccountable bureaucrats or agencies who are elites and feel like they know better than you. So you see it with what's going on with Hinkson Creek locally. You see it with the Department of Energy or Interior. I guess it's Interior. Basically, a moratorium on any kind of drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. The grand champ, of course, is the EPA, with everything from cap and trade to shutting down coal mines in West Virginia, and on and on and on. So it always creates more of that. Another thing that's a hallmark of these kind of systems and why people are concerned about it, including me, in case you hadn't guessed, is failure in a way. I don't know why it is, but it's always been the case, and it always will be, that there's a whole lot of people think that if we can just get wise and far-sighted people in government to make decisions, we'll be just great. And yet the record of failure is just amazing. They never can beat a free market, and that the great economist Friedrich Hayek gave the reason in The Road to Serfdom and other writings, namely, these wise people with all their degrees and all their knowledge, they cannot match a free market where there's experimentation, millions of actors, and back and forth. In other words, they don't have the knowledge. They cannot possibly get to the knowledge base that a free market provides, so that decisions will always be made better by free markets and price signals to get us where we need to be. And so it's fairly elementary, but the free market works, and wise men in Washington just doesn't seem to do a very good job. Next, seventh, not very well thought about or commented on, but I think military decline becomes inevitable when you go this other route, the collectivist route. The reason is you're spending all your money on something else. And there really was such a thing as Pax Britannica in the 19th century and Pax Americana in the 20th century. And we have been a worldwide sheriff. Not always right, not always good, but pretty good. And we've helped secure the peace a lot more than most people realize by our various endeavors around the world, because we were a big, tough guy, and you didn't want to mess with us. And so if we lose all that, I really fear as to what's going to happen. You can see the respect draining away right now, because everybody knows we don't have the mojo or the money like we used to for that important area. Finally, 8, this is how you ultimately end up as Greece or France, and all you have to do is watch what's been going on there to realize that that's a direction that should give anyone pause. My favorite part of that is the French riots this last year, where people were rioting because they didn't want to have to work from age 60 on to age 62. I mean, how pathetic. That's what these kind of systems do to you. Okay, those are the big issues. Now let's talk about some thoughts going forward about just some thoughts as we look at these big time issues. One, it really doesn't have to be the way we've been traveling. Actually, it shouldn't be that way. We're a center-right country, as I just said. That 42% to 20% breakdown. And there's a poll that has been taken, and it just has consistent results. If I'm smart enough to find the book. There's a great book, by the way, by a man named Arthur Brooks. He's the head of the American Enterprise Institute. His book is The Battle: How the Fight Between Free Enterprise and Big Government Will Shape America's Future. Well, anyway, the poll is 70% of Americans support the free enterprise system and are unsupportive of big government. By contrast, somewhere between 20 and 30% of the adult population oppose free market, free enterprise, and prefers government to solutions to our problems. The 30% coalition is led by people who are smart, powerful, and strategic. These are many of the people who make opinions, entertain us, inform us, teach our kids in college. They are in the intellectual upper class. Those in the top 5% of the population in income, who hold graduate degrees and work in intellectual industries such as law, education, journalism, and entertainment. You got the picture? The elites. But as I said, it doesn't have to be this way, because 70% feel differently. They feel like I was talking about earlier. But the 20 to 30%, let's call it the 30%, the 30% are running things. So it will take a lot of work and a lot of pushback, and I would have some cautionary comments. When you think about it, our experiment, starting in really 1789 or thereabouts, when the Constitution was, when we got that all set up, I hate to say it, this is the unusual state of affairs. If you read your history and then look around the world today, you're going to find out, unfortunately, that systems that are heavy into protection of individual liberty are unusual. They're not that common. Therefore, it's very important not to lose that for the reasons I think I've outlined. But it's just an interesting comment on that. It'd be hard to change, too, because so many people are now invested in this trend, this long trend. As I said, nearly a half don't pay any income tax. More than that, get some kind of government benefit. Many are dependent on the welfare state. Public employee unions like it just fine. Most favored companies, they like it pretty well. And of course, the 30% that I just talked about that don't much care for our free enterprise system, they don't care for it. They don't want to go back. So it's a formidable array of opponents if you want to get back to where the Constitution was originally set up to be. So what will happen? Well, one thing for sure is, and this is just my personal opinion, I am really tired of inarticulate candidates that won't talk about stuff like this. Think about it. There was Bush 1, Bob Dole, Bush 2, and McCain. They were somewhere between poor and pathetic about talking about stuff like this. There is a good case to be made, and by the way, there's a very good case in the battle about the moral underpinnings that make capitalism and free markets superior. So the case is there. 70% already agree with you, but don't talk like a stumblebum or refuse to talk about it at all. So my point is that great leaders really do educate and inspire people. I hope somebody comes along that can do a good job of persuading people that the constitutional approach as originally envisioned still has some mojo and it ought to continue. I can't help it, I got to quote this. This is from Margaret Thatcher, long time ago. And she was addressing, I think, her own party, but in one of her speeches she said the following. She is a person that understood this completely and told it like it was. The root of the matter is this. We have been ruled by men who live by illusions. The illusion that you can spend money you haven't earned without eventually going bankrupt or falling into the hands of your creditors. The illusion that real jobs can be conjured into existence by government decree like rabbits out of a hat. The illusion that there is some other way of creating wealth than hard work and satisfying your customers. The illusion that you can have freedom and enterprise without believing in free enterprise. The illusion that you can have an effective foreign policy without a strong defense force and a peaceful and orderly society without absolute respect for the law. I don't think I've heard anybody talk like that in this country for a while. And so I guess I'm just saying, I hope we have a more upfront and spirited defense of the free market enterprise system that has done so much for us. Where do we go from here? I don't know. I think things may be looking up. I don't forget, and I don't have any doubt that the mainstream media and the Democrats will make it difficult because they're mostly in the 30% coalition. But don't forget two things. One I already talked about. We do have a lot of people that are onto this issue and are very engaged and are very, very upset about the direction and want to do something about it. They're not going away. Secondly, we also have something called the alternative media. Back in the old days, that wasn't true, but you don't always have to go through the filter of the networks, New York Times, et cetera, to get your news about that stuff. So I don't look at these issues as going away. My hope is that things tip in the direction of what James Madison wanted it to be in the very beginning. So I do hope that things go in that direction. I guess we'll have to wait and see because I think it's going to be an interesting few years ahead of us as we see what kind of a country do we really want. Is it going to be a Euro-socialist, statist, collectivist operation? Or are we going to be a true free market, free enterprise, liberty-loving country that was originally designed? So I hope this has been interesting and helpful to you. I've enjoyed it, and thank you very much for coming. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Yeah, Andy?
Do you have any opinion on which congressional seat we might lose?
My guess is it'll be Congressman Russ Carnahan's seat in the St. Louis area. As I said, Republicans have those red gerrymandering pens already. He will probably get put in with Lacey Clay or something like that. That would be my guess. Yeah.
How do you foresee the U.S. Senate race in Missouri? 2012?
Well, we subscribe to the Rasmussen reports, and one of the commentators there is a guy some of you may have heard of, Larry Sabato from the University of Virginia, who does a very good job of handicapping things. He's so good at it, I can't even tell how he leads. So he's a true pro. But in his estimation, he went through the Senate in the last couple of weeks, and the Democrats have some problems. They have 13 or 23 seats up. Republicans only have 8 or 10, as I recall. But of course, Senator McCaskill is up. He rated her as very vulnerable. Now, personally, I think that's a little strong. I would put her as vulnerable because of a lot of reasons, not least of which is we seem to be acting like a red state lately. But she's pretty capable. I don't think I could go very vulnerable. But yeah, I would look. Plus, you got to have something. You can't have nothing to beat something. Got to have a decent candidate too. So we'll see. What's that?
Why don't you run, Bob?
I'm not electable. Or interested. Yeah, Gary.
How much impact do you think the Tea Party, is there a candidate for president that they might really get behind on the Republican ticket?
I think, well, assuming they are enthusiastic and approving, I think they'll have a tremendous amount of influence because they're serious about their concerns and they work hard. They will work. So I think they'd have a lot of impact, mostly behind the scenes. What's that?
2 years ago, John McCain won the Republican primary in Missouri, and I'm fairly involved in politics, and I've never found anybody that voted for him.
You what?
I've never found anybody that voted for him in the primary. There may be people here, I'm not sure. I don't know how come he won the primary.
I think it was already a fait accompli by then, and people thought, well, he's going to be the nominee. I'll just go vote for him. That's what I heard from people.
That's what I want the Tea Party to do.
Oh, they'll do a lot of vetting, believe me. Yeah, Bruce?
Bob, I enjoyed your comment or quote from Madison, who happened to be one of my favorites also. One of my least favorites is Hamilton, but even Hamilton said something in Federalist 28. He said, it may safely be received as an axiom in our political system that state governments will, in all possible contingencies, offer security against invasion and public liberty for the national authority. How much do you think the states, or is it direct voting by the public on the national level that will come to our aid and do things to restore our constitutional government?
That's what you call a complex compound question. I'm not 100% sure I got all that, Bruce.
Well, do you think the states with nullification, which we see a lot of it, in the issue of health care and minor issues, whether it be interposition or outright nullification discussions, you hear it a lot in our state, how much will that move the federal government to restrain its growth versus direct vote of the population on the national level?
I don't know. You have a lot of people in office in the states that are very concerned about these issues. They know they can't afford these increased Medicaid mandates that are coming from Obamacare. They know that they can't do some other things they're going to have to do. So they're trying to develop a strategy to figure out how to fight back and get a little more federalism like we originally had in this country. But I don't have any way of really knowing where that will all go. And there are interesting ideas being thrown about as legal ways to stop the reach and scope and power of the federal government. In other words, some state action. But I've only read a little of that, so I couldn't comment on it very much. Yeah, Donna?
You would say that if it hadn't been for the Tea Party, the Republican Party would have not done very well this past election.
Well, they were the only default position for people that weren't going to vote for the Democrats, but they wouldn't have done nearly as well, in my opinion. Tea Party's made a big difference. I mean, they could have gone and voted for libertarians. They could have gone and run as independents. So they made a big difference. Yeah, Hunter?
I'm afraid that I'm more pessimistic about the electorate than you are. Maybe you could expand on that. From what I know about France, the polls of the French public say they're quite happy with their quality of life. Their productivity is not bad. They're happy with it. The electorate that you say has all of a sudden become so intelligent was the same electorate that put Obama in office and huge majorities in Congress. And wouldn't you expect that it'd just be ping pong back and forth?
Good. Yeah, I didn't say I was all that optimistic. I just talked about the different. Yeah, I don't know that I'm pessimistic. As I said, there's something in our DNA as Americans that's a little different from other countries. I mean, despite it all, 42% of us say we're either conservative or very conservative. I just think a lot of people haven't been paying attention for a long time, and that's partly the fault of the politicians for not talking about these issues. I mean, there's more than twice as many conservative or very conservative people as there are liberals. At least that's what they tell the pollsters, and it's been a trend for quite a while. So I think we are a little different from the Europeans. We're less likely to want that hammock of the welfare state. We're more entrepreneurial, and like I say, it's almost in our DNA. They like to think that America is the place where their sweepings went, but I think what happened is the hard chargers and creative and daring people came over here, and it's still happening. So I think that I'm not as pessimistic as you, but I'm the first to admit that it's kind of hard to win this war without getting a lot more converts. Anybody else? Yeah.
I guess my question is, I asked it to someone who's perhaps more comfortable taking the label of libertarian as opposed to conservative libertarian. You mentioned 6 or 7 things as the major issues, and you also mentioned, though, that Republicans are to some extent just as complicit in big government and big spending and deficit spending as the Democrats.
Well, in the last 10 years.
Okay. But if that's the case, and we also look, I would also point out that...
Not quite as complicit. I'm just saying
No.
they didn't have a very good record, let's put it that way.
And I would agree.
Kind of hard to compete against the last 2 years.
If we look at like a main means of growing the state and expanding state power and seizing the bureaucratic power, crisis is, of course, an excellent way to do that. War, principally, has been throughout much of human history in all cultures. And so if we think about that, you mentioned that the last thing you mentioned, I think, was the war and the military spending and our decline militarily around the globe. But at the same time, don't you think that if crony capitalism is really an issue for you, and it is for me, and I know it is for you,
I said it.
How can you not legitimately offer a critique, and a major critique, for the massive standing army, the military-industrial complex? Again, we have a president, President Eisenhower, along with President Washington before him, both warned against that. We have to pass a bill every 2 years to allow the standing army to continue. How can we really, and this is something that I was really surprised about Rand Paul's proposal for budget cuts, is that there's pretty much no mention at all that we're spending between $500 and $1 trillion a year on undeclared wars. And I just don't see how we can offer criticisms of statist policy and domestically without looking at that. And that is just as much crony capitalism. I mean, billions of dollars in no-bid contracts a week. And also, it's bringing a lot of really disturbing effects, I think, also in the country with respect to some of these military technologies that are not being used for domestic policing. And all of that's connected. And I just felt that one area that you didn't really mention enough was that, that there's just as much potential for cutting big government and crony capitalism for, what you might call a breadbasket issue on the right. And that, of course, is this big elephant in the room. I mean, no one's even talking about the fact that we spend more than every other major power combined and every other power in the history of man. how can we not like talk about that as part of the meeting?
Well, I'll plead guilty as charged to part of what you say, for sure. I could have included crony capitalist problems with respect to military spending too. I just didn't think of any offhand. But I agree with you. I mean, that's been a problem there too. Why would I exempt the military from the general indictment that I'm sick and tired of most favored company status on domestic issues not applying to the military budget also? And it's been a long-term problem. We all know that. And there's been a lot of the proverbial waste, fraud, and abuse in that area. So the only reason I didn't mention it is I just couldn't think of a good example offhand, although they're out there and they always will be.
But I guess it was more because you said that it was important that we maintain our leadership role in the world.
Yeah.
And I just don't see how we can really do that, and I mean, how we can do that and cut spending. Because, you know, and what's more, how would you say, what market solutions are there to our leadership role in the world? It seems like a pretty obviously statist policy. You know, how do we?
Not sure I follow everything. Here's where I'm coming from, though. There's probably a lot of things in that military budget, thanks to a strong or important senator or congressman, that the Pentagon and the Secretary of Defense don't want. That's just political life. It'd be great to get rid of stuff like that and go with the really important weapon systems and other personnel, et cetera, and be as lean and mean and as effective as possible. So there is some of that stuff there, and some of it gets there by crony capitalism. Okay, we get all that. My main point was, though, that we still, through it all, despite the criticism, despite stupid mistakes and dumb wars here and there, we are still a force for good and stability and security around the world. And if you don't have any money left over after all of your social spending, you're not going to be able to keep it up and keep doing that sort of stuff. And then all the rogue regimes around the world are going to be on the march. That was my concern about it. Doesn't have anything to do with crony capitalism, et cetera. I just want to make sure we have a strong military that projects power appropriately around the world, because we're probably needed more than ever right now. Yes.
You mentioned nullification and other checks on federal power. And I was wondering if you identify any direct democracy mechanisms that, well, for instance, like initiative petitions that you think are viable and useful in rebalancing power structure.
Yeah. I wish I could say that I did. There's a lot of writing going on about these issues, and a lot of people are talking about this for some way for states to push back and corral the excesses of the federal government. The problem is it's all in a state of flux, and I've just read little bits and pieces here and there, so I can't give you any, well, I guess as I told the prior questioner, I can't give you any details on it, but I am very supportive of trying to do something to restore federalism to this republic and end the overreach of the federal government's reach and influence, and that's just one thing. Sorry, that's not. I don't have a concrete answer, but they'll be coming down the road because smart people, concerned people, are seriously looking at that issue. Anything else? Have I exhausted everybody's questions? Good. Yeah.
How close do you think we are to eliminating state income?
State income tax? I don't know if that'll get much traction right now or not. I think it's a good idea, but it's particularly hard right now. And the reason is there's a lot of difficult factors, as Ed Robb has talked about when he was here. And to do it as we go to the worst budget year ever, it's particularly difficult from a time standpoint. But is it a good idea? Darn right it is. And I still remember reading some studies done by, I think it was the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. The two single most important things about whether a state does well or not over the last 30 years or so is, do they have a state income tax, and is it a right-to-work state? And that just infuriates people on the other side, but it's a simple fact. There are 9 states that have no income tax. 7 of those 9 lead everybody else in rate of growth. The other 2 lead their regions. They're just a little slower in their region. The region is slower. So, to me, but it's just hard to do. Politically, it may be there, but it's just going to be hard to construct right now. And by the way, the right to work is the other issue. There are 22 right to work states, and every one of them seem to be doing better than the others. And not only is it an economic issue, it's a freedom issue. Why should you have to pay union dues just in an agency shop if you don't want to join the union? So to me, that's just as important an issue. So those two items make a big difference. And so when people call me on those issues, I say, let me remind you of something. I remember 1980. We had an election then, and it was a census year. Guess what? We lost a House seat. We were 10 seats. We went down to 9. 30 years later, we've lost another seat. Missouri has not been growing like a heck of a lot of others have, obviously, since we've lost 2 seats in Congress in 30 years to the growers. And a lot of those growers, in fact, are right-to-work states and no state income tax states. So that was a long, awkward answer, but I think and I deviated. I started talking a little bit about why I'm in favor of it. But I think it'll be hard to get done this year, but I hope they can.
For those that might be interested about the right work bill in the Senate will be a committee.
Yeah, that one is moving along. Can that survive a veto?
No, but of course we're still trying to push some for a constitutional amendment to bypass the government.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Get my stuff in.
Did they take your food away? I've never been in this room before. Maybe somebody can fill me in. Is this a kitchen back here or a bowling alley? Bob, thank you very much. That was very informative, very instructive, and we enjoyed it very much. And the questions were great. Thank you all for taking part in this. Thank you all for joining us today. I think of all the messages that we received from Bob's talk is that we definitely need to get the message out, and we need your help, your continued support to do that at the Show Me Institute. Please do take a look at our new website if you haven't already. We're excited about it. Any comments, suggestions, ideas you may have about it, feel free to send them to us. I do have one little closing note. The Show Me Book Club meeting was canceled last week due to the weather, as you might imagine. And so it is going to meet next month, if you're a regular on that. Tim Sandifer from the Cato Institute has a new book out. It's called The Right to Earn a Living. That is going to be discussed on March 2nd at 6 p.m. Is that right, Katie? At Shakespeare's West location. And please contact Katie Sinkfield or Steve Spellman if you would like to receive some more information about the book club. Again, I enjoyed meeting all of you. Come up and say hello after we're done, if you would, please. And thanks for the support and the interesting dialogue here. And Bob, thank you again.